The 80s had The General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlo Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlo Highland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms.
So you've probably covered over your career something like well over 100 gangland murders, but why would you have chosen the murder of Marlo Highland and obviously the murder of Anthony Campbell, the plumber, as well? Why did you choose that to do a serial podcast on?
I have to be honest, I've always thought of Anthony Campbell's mother. Always thought about her, over the years. I don't mean every day of my life, but just, do you recall that murder happening?
I do. I remember being in a newsroom when it happened, and I probably wasn't so much of focused on crime, but I remember it kind of being one of those stories that interrupted everything in a newsroom.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It was one of those moments of kind of stop and stand still, and it wasn't probably because of Marlo Highland, because his end was almost inevitable, really.
Yeah.
And I was probably similar to you. I think while I was covering crime, I don't think I was that totally engaged in gangland crime at the time. I was aware of who Marlo Highland was, but I wouldn't have been kind of writing about that stuff on a daily basis. But it was the plumber, it was the young boy that had been out at the house. And there was a photograph of Anthony Campbell that was used and still used today because, of course, he is frozen in time for every reason. But he was really baby-faced, real innocent looking.
Yeah.
And then there was this, whole idea that he's on his apprenticeship. He's out in that house in Scribblestown Park in Finglas. He was working on a radiator that morning.
Yeah. And
the plumber had gone to get supplies and left him doing whatever he was doing or minding the job. And these two gunmen burst into the house. He had no idea there was anyone sleeping upstairs. And one of them ran up the stairs and shot Marlo Highland dead. And on their way out, they killed Anthony Campbell. It was so senseless.
It was very callous, I see, because if you look at some of the other murders, I remember the murder of Shane Gagan in Limerick when he was shot. That was a case of mistaken identity. Where they thought Shane Gagan was a criminal. Like this, and that has happened, and it's, Shane Gagan was another one of those stop and become aware of what's happening moments. But Anthony Campbell, it always struck me as extremely callous because, it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate decision to kill somebody just because of the off chance that somebody could be recognised in the future. Yeah,
I mean, that was what was sort of said and is still said, really, that, did one of the killers think he could identify them? Did he know either of them from the locality where he was living? Yeah, it was the most callous. There was no mistaken identity. They knew.
Yeah.
The gunman who lifted his gun and shot him dead that morning knew that he was a young apprentice plumber working on a radiator, and he killed him anyway.
And of course, there is always in gangland, and you see it in series like The Wire or whatever, where people make a distinction between people that are in the game and people that aren't, that are regular citizens. And one of the justifications people tell themselves that are involved in gangland crime in particular, that the other person that I might be shooting at, they've also made a decision to become involved in this life, and therefore they're kind of, everybody's a soldier and it's a war and it's kind of acceptable. I mean, Anthony Campbell was, whatever way you look at it, there is no moral justification for what happened there, and he had no involvement in any of that life.
Yeah, and then it was, of course, is it just the picture? I think it was the fact that he was a mother's only child.
Yeah.
As well. It was coming up to Christmas.
Yeah.
Everything about it was just so, unfathomable.
Yeah.
How this could have happened in our city. And, gangland activity goes on, and you're right, people sort of see it as there's an inevitability to those who make decisions and who rise to the top. And when they rise to the top, there's always a fall.
Yeah.
And certainly Marlo Hyland had become so paranoid. His operation was being targeted at the time, he was a dead man walking.
Yeah.
But I always thought of that lady, his mother, because she did certainly some press conferences in the aftermath of it, and she was interviewed a few times, and she was so dignified. And her loss, not that if you have another child it's okay to lose one because you've one left. I don't mean that in a million years. It's just the idea of somebody having one child and that child being taken from them like that.
And I suppose, like, as we both have kids of teenage years, and she'd kind of seen him through the teenage years, hasn't she? Where you think, well, you know, he was he 20? Sorry,
he was 20, but he did 20. Look younger. Yeah.
But she'd kind of seen him through the teenage years, seen him through his school years. He was in a profession. He was doing well. He was getting work. He was, you know, he was entered adult life.
I think you're out of the woods, do you?
Yeah, kind of.
And of course, I mean, you know, nothing that he had done.
Yeah.
There was so many sliding doors moments really with it, and we discussed that in the podcast. You know, he had actually got a job with another plumber.
Yeah.
And had been let go shortly before Christmas, and had just picked up this new work, and he was sort of delighted with himself that he was back working because he'd have a few bob for Christmas, and whatever he wanted to do, buy his mother a present was one of the things that she speaks about in the podcast, that she hates Christmas.
Yeah.
She can't absolutely bear Christmas, because their little thing together was that they used to go out on a Christmas Eve and go shopping and buy one another a present, and you know, you could visualize it, can't you?
Yeah.
And they'd hand over the presents, and that was their thing they did together. So she just still to this day can't cope with it.
And of course that happened, the murder of Anthony Campbell. It was kind of a consequence, really, which was 2 decades of bloodletting, really, in Finglas. I mean, that started sometime in the 90s and probably finished sometime after the death of Eamon Dunn. Like, over that 2 decades, there was a huge number of people killed by, you know, kind of a small circle of people that began maybe with PJ Judge, followed on through Marlo Hyland, who killed quite a lot of people, or ordered the murder of quite a lot of people. He was then killed, and then that followed through with Eamon Dunn, who you know, I think it was estimated that he killed about 16 people, many members of his own criminal organisation. And I suppose you think people sort of ask the question, you know, what can you do about gangland, or they're just shooting each other? But I suppose you can see why these things have to be stopped, can't you, and what happened in that?
Sure. I mean, for the security of the public. And I mean, how many stories have we covered or written about or broadcast about that, you know, there's somebody there saying it was a miracle nobody else was killed.
Yeah.
Something just coming to mind to me at the moment was the murder of Keith Brannigan in the caravan park up in Clogherhead, was it?
Yeah, it was.
Part of the Drogheda feud. And there was evidence that was like a semi-automatic that was sprayed at him and around cars with kids sitting in them, and people had gone into shops and they came back and there's bullet holes in these cars, and it was a completely crazy, chaotic murder targeted at him, but that could have easily taken out God knows how many people closing up their mobile homes for the end of the summer. So nearly in every one of these gangland hits, you know, certainly the ones that occur outdoors in public, there is a question, oh God, that person was very lucky they got away with it. This one in particular, because it was going to be conducted in a contained environment, which was the house where he was sleeping in, there should have been nobody else in that house at that moment. It just, like, as you say from the beginning, there was such a callousness to it. There was no accident here.
Yeah.
This was no mistaken identity. This was somebody who raised a gun at that young boy and shot anyway.
Yeah.
As no doubt, if he could have spoken in the terror of those moments, would have begged for his life.
And I think in the aftermath and listening to the first episode, Christine Campbell, like, she speaks about that kind of survivor's guilt, I suppose it's fair to say, about the aftermath of the shooting, how she was almost propelled against her will, I suppose, to speak publicly in order to seek justice and the consequences that has had for her life, really.
So basically, the reason we've done this podcast, Caught in the Crossfire, is for a number of reasons. And the primary reason is probably because that murder of Anthony Campbell, and as a consequence of Marlo Hyland, because they are linked forever together.
Yeah.
You know, but they both remain unsolved.
Yeah.
And yet we can all bandy around the names of the two gunmen, the suspects.
Yeah.
As could Christine from the very beginning. And, you know, that seems so deeply unfair that she has had to endure 17 years of this hell, this grief, which has completely consumed her, and made her feel bloody guilty that she's still there and that there's nobody spent a day in jail for Anthony's murder. So she feels all these emotions. And I suppose the point of doing it is, can it be solved?
Yeah.
You know, is there stones left unturned in it? Has there been developments in forensic science, in whatever else, in investigation techniques that could actually solve this case and bring somebody before the courts and at least take that sense from her, that extra layer on top of all the layers that are there in her grief, that I suppose we as a state could actually do something for that woman and others. And no doubt, I didn't speak to Anthony's father, but I'm sure his father has exactly those same feelings as a parent. He's lost his son. It's an interesting story to focus on for so many reasons, because it was one of those stories that made us all sit up and realise this gangland thing that we kind of park and compartmentalise over there, all of a sudden it's come crashing into the real world, into our world, where it could have been any of our kids, any of us that was out working that day and got killed in that way. So, you know, what is it about that moment that brings this to the national consciousness? This is happening all the time anyway.
Yeah.
And examining, I suppose, how we as a society look on these murders and how we have the ability to try and compartmentalise this world, even though it exists cheek by jowl with us.
Yeah, because of course the other side of it is there is two unsolved murders. There's the murder of Marlo Hyland. And do you feel that people like Marlo Hyland had relatives, kids, loved ones? Do you feel that people in that circumstance, because people love a criminal, like if it's your father or your relative, they're equally bereft. The fact that they don't make that calculation that, well, you know, he did this, therefore he got what he deserved. You know, do you think that Marlo Hyland's, you know, murder, for example, people like Marlo Hyland being killed, you know, do you think the public can just say that doesn't matter in a way?
I think in the eyes of the law, his life, and in the eyes of the Gardaí investigating it, his murder is of equal importance as such to Anthony Campbell's murder. I think probably Marlo Hyland's family, I can't speak for them. Maybe they feel they aren't entitled to a voice for him to speak up for him. That world that he comes from is all about things happening and moving on, isn't it? And, you know, there's a sense of, if you speak up or out or to the media, you're looked down upon, you're frowned upon. You know, it's part of the rules of existing in that world that, you know, there are punishments and there is an end, sometimes as brutal as that. Do I personally see them as equal victims? No, I don't. I think Marlo Hyland made choices in life, and I think he was responsible for a lot of hurt and misery in other lives. He was driven by power, by wealth, and you know, ultimately, I think really actually by the power. I think he loved being able to instill that sense of fear into people. And of course, my old friend Joey O'Callaghan has contributed to this podcast, and he has spoken about being a 14-year-old child and being brought to meet Marlo Hyland, and he very articulately describes how he believed he was never going to make it home alive from that meeting. He talks about, you know, the sort of the sense of who Marlo was at that time and how feared he was and his presence. So he chose and did all that. Anthony Campbell chose none of that.
Yeah.
And he was out. So I don't, even though that's not a very PC thing to say, I don't see them as equal victims. I think Anthony Campbell's death is far more worth pursuing justice for, maybe, than Marlo Highland's. Now, that is not the way the state sees things. No. That's not the way the eyes of the law see things, nor is it the way the Gardaí can see things. And in actual fact, that is very clearly put and explained by the retired Chief Superintendent, Christy Mangan, in this podcast as well. He discusses that. We do actually delve into that as well.
And why was Marlo Hyland killed? He obviously, we've written about him so many times, but I suppose and as it's described in The Decade, you probably have one most prominent criminal in the country for each decade. If you look at Martin Cahill in the 80s or John Gilligan in the 90s, Marlo Hyland was the same for the 2000s. He had a kind of rapid rise, I think, to that position as number one gangster in the country. There may be other people abroad that were making more money or pulling strings, but he was really the man at the centre of armed gangs in Ireland, really, wasn't he?
Like, he really was. And I suppose it's a kind of a familiar trajectory with Marlo. You know, there's the armed robberies, they make the money from that, pump it into buying loads of drugs, sell the loads of drugs, wholesale them, make even more money, fund it through violence, I suppose. And then there's that sense of power and control that he has that grows and grows and grows. He's become so big, really, by 2006 that the Gardaí put in gangland crime is, on the rise. Yeah. Politicians are getting up on their feet in the Dáil and they're demanding, something's done about this. So there is a crackdown. There's funding given for a Garda operation to look at gangland crime in general, really, in Dublin, and to try and identify where resources need to be put. And in doing that kind of overview of gangland crime, there's a realization about how big Marlo has become, how big his turf is, and how powerful he is. So a separate operation is developed just to target Marlo's crew. Yeah. And it is a typical sort of tango style policing, which has its effects because, if you looked at it from an academic point of view, you put the resources into a particular gang to dismantling them. It results in seizures of drugs, of guns, arrests. Yeah. That causes paranoia within the ranks because clearly there's somebody. These are mostly intelligence-led operations.
Back then, when electronic surveillance wouldn't have been as sophisticated.
Exactly. So, somebody like Marlo probably using a hell of a lot of cocaine himself because that seems to be, gives an extra layer of paranoia and to these guys. He's starting to not know who he can trust at all. I think there's members of his own organisation who think he's the problem. If we can get rid of Marlo, we might the heat might back off a little bit from the cops. We might be able to get back to business. He's gone too far. He's just kind of a liability. Yeah. So, it is members of his own grouping that are suspected of taking him on and taking him out in the same way probably he rose to power. Yeah. Eamon the Don Dunn comes in after him.
And of course, both Marlo Hyland and Eamon Dunn, part of the reason that the attention, the Garda attention and the political pressure comes on them is because they are ordering murders. There are probably at the same time in this country guys who are making something equivalent in terms of money and they just don't get that attention because both Marlo Hyland and Eamon Dunn ordered a lot of murders and many of them for minor or relatively minor or personal issues.
Yeah, you can see both of them often, target members of their own gang and kill them because they perceive that they're either giving information or that they might. Yeah. So that sort of absolute break with reality comes into their own daily life and it just implodes. Yeah. It implodes. And sometimes actually, while it's a really dangerous way to dismantle a gang, it can be the quickest way to dismantle a gang when they do implode.
Because, of course, you're talking Marlo Highland, who was the number one criminal maybe in the country. It's still 20 or 30 people really, isn't it, as a core gang member. Now, obviously, they're supplying drugs to other organisations, but those organisations are, while they're interacting with each other, they're kind of separate. And I actually listened to a podcast on Pablo Escobar, and they're talking, even his organisation was really like something around 100 people. So if you dismantle, in Marlo's case, if you take 5, 6, 7, 8 people, like all of a sudden the pressure really comes on him. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, happened to Marlo Highland, didn't it? In the run-up to his death. A few people got put behind bars or faced charges. There were seizures. And all of a sudden, from being this sort of untouchable figure, he was effectively moving from house to house. And
he was staying out in that house. It was a house of a relative, a niece of his owned that house, and he was staying there, sleeping with a samurai sword by his side. You know, from a crime scene point of view, maybe I thought this was quite interesting. Marlo was probably killed in his sleep.
Yeah.
Which is probably a more peaceful death than that Anthony Campbell had. As he stood downstairs, the scenario that, you know, we sort of visualise is that there's one guy outside in a car that's aiming the Don. 2 men who we do name in the podcast, the suspects who are suspected of being the 2 men. They go inside. One of them holds Anthony at gunpoint downstairs and tells him not to move. And he hears the other gunman thunder up the stairs, hears the gunshots and hears him come back down. For me, one of the most sort of poignant moments of it was the description by both his mother, Christine, and by Brian Sherry, who's a retired detective, Garda's detective inspector, his right title, who was headed up that investigation. And I mean, it was a career changer for him. He ended up actually retiring because we couldn't deal with it. He was so terribly upset, having been to countless crime scenes, what he saw that morning. But both of them describe the injury to Anthony's hand. Yeah. So the bullet would have travelled through his hand, where he obviously put his hand up to save himself.
An instinctive reaction.
And sure, you know, no human being is a match for a bullet.
No. I mean, all of these years, so it's 17 years, you said later. I mean, Christine Campbell certainly was in the papers a lot, and then has been in the papers over the years. She's spoken about it again. What sort of healing has occurred for her over that time? I mean, obviously it's something you can never recover from. How has she processed it, and has she been able to sort of get on with her life?
Well, she has a life.
Yeah.
So she has done stuff over the years, and from speaking to her, and we travelled over to see her. She lives in England now, and we were with her for a long time and conducted a very long interview with her, which was, I'm sure, really difficult for her. And I'm always conscious when you're going to interview, it's the night before. Yeah. Often when you land in somebody's house to do an interview, you know, they haven't slept a bloody wink the night before, because it's all going around in their head and you're bringing it back up. So it's a very difficult process for the interviewee. And I think always when she's done those interviews, she's done them for Anthony in the hope that something will happen, that somebody may come forward. And obviously, with the length of time, there is a hope of that now.
Yes.
You know, there are people perhaps who gave alibis and stuff who are in different positions now in life, and people who have information maybe aren't so scared, or shouldn't be so scared now to come forward with that information, because there probably really only is a small little piece of this jigsaw that's needed to complete it, you know, and to maybe move it forward to the courts situation. But I always reckon that any of those interviews she's done and any of the pushes she's done is all coupled with that awful guilt she describes about she just hasn't done enough for her child.
Yeah.
She hasn't seen justice done for him. And that weighs heavy still on her. I mean, I would think, and from having spoken to her, there's pictures of Anthony up all over her beautiful home. And he's still very much in her heart.
Yeah.
I'd say you talk to people who've lost a child or somebody very, very close to them, and they talk about the guilt they feel as the time increases. I think in the beginning of a grief like that, all you're feeling is trauma.
Yeah.
And everything's running around in your head and over again. And there comes a time where that trauma just becomes a normal thing in your head. And then you move on to another stage of grief. And she has all those stages of grief, but she still hasn't had any outcome from it all. And that was the biggest thing I took from her. There's nobody going to be able to do anything to help her, to heal her.
Yeah.
You know, she will just have to live the rest of her life with that enormity of the loss that she has. Not a day goes by she doesn't think of Anthony, remembers him very fondly.
Yeah.
At the same time, has nice memories there, 2 of them, you know. But she has a family and a support unit around her, and enjoys the company of her partner's grandkids, and has that, at least, and is in a loving relationship. So she has things in life, but nothing could ever replace what she lost.
And it's a funny thing, isn't it, that survivor's guilt? I mean, objectively, you could stand back and say, how can she feel that it's up to her to solve the crime?
Exactly.
But that's, and of course, it can't be up to her, but that's how she feels, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with these things, I suppose, going unsolved, or people looking for answers that they maybe, without getting it, it's very hard for people to move on, you know.
And look, I mean, the point of doing the podcast is for so many reasons, but, you know, we were able to interview her, and then we've created this, and it was a difficult podcast to do because you're trying to merge 2 worlds that shouldn't be together.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And you're trying to tell, I suppose, the story of Marlo Highland while also
telling a story of an innocent victim.
Exactly.
And, you know, funnily enough, actually, when we do stories sometimes in the Sunday World, and if it's a case, say, where a husband kills a wife, you'll have the family, even if, you know, they might ring up and say, look, we don't mind you writing about it, but can you not use the picture of the 2 of them together?
Yeah.
You know, and that's a really common thing, isn't it? We've heard that so many times over the years. They're not even saying don't write about our dead, you know, sister or whatever. Just saying don't have that picture together. And that's, you know, Christine Campbell has also had to have that, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And like, you have to try and very sort of sensitively put it together. And also, even the title of it, Caught in the Crossfire, came out upstairs. I think it was Brian Farrell, our editor, came up with, sorry, was it you?
It was me, yeah. Can never get any credit.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'll give you the credit. You came up with it. Because, of course, we were throwing around titles for it. And the title and the artwork done by Enda Bulger on the front of it had to be sensitively done as well.
Exactly.
You know, whose picture was more prominent, which victim, which was more. And I hope what we settled upon and Caught in the Crossfire was exactly it, because, you know, I was kind of going wrong place, wrong time. And I know that Christine Campbell hates that phrase because she doesn't feel her son, you know,
was in the
wrong place or should have been. I mean, he was just out doing his job, you know. I can totally get that, why that would be really irritating. So hopefully Caught in the Crossfire, and I hope that we get across her story, and I hope ultimately that, you know, the podcast will make enough noise and, you know, maybe remind people of it as an unsolved case. And, you know, that ultimately something will come of it, and maybe that last bit of evidence, or maybe some, you know, some new push will see a reinvestigation of the case, and maybe if we could just take that little bit from her, that she feels guilty that she's never had justice for him, because of course, you know, it's timely for so many reasons. Firstly, one of the suspected gunmen who we name in the podcast was serving time in prison on an unrelated offence and has recently got out. So both the suspected gunmen are now free in the community. I think they're both very dangerous men, by the way. And, you know, they're out there free and living.
Yeah, and some of the people that witnesses may have had to fear are no longer with us and are long past. And, you know, people that may have been associated with that life back in the 2000s, they may have grown up, had their own kids, and may feel in a position now where that kind of omerta that you can't say anything, maybe they don't feel like that anymore. And even we know that can be one of the great ways crimes are solved with the passage of time, that people, their moral values change and may feel that something small can really make a difference. So
for sure, and that's before you look at the advances in the science. I think the thing is that, you know, these stories, there's so much to them. You try and write it, I suppose, within an article, and you're so restricted in your space and in your ability to really give the reader, in that case, the time to consider exactly what has happened. I think with a podcast, there's something about the audio that people can really connect. I mean, you can hear
Brian Sherry. I mean, the Brian Sherry, the waver in his voice. Brian Sherry, the retired detective inspector. When you hear the waver in his voice, I think it really strikes home in a way that the written word would find it hard to capture.
Exactly. And I mean, you can connect with Christine. You can actually, you know, you can hear her breathing while she's telling the story. You can hear her gulping back tears. You can hear all those things that are very difficult, I suppose, unless you have a larger form of a book or something to be able to describe them. So I think the audio format is really powerful medium, especially in sort of reminding people about what this loss is. It's not just a headline. It's not just a picture. This is a human being that is still missed.
And how many? So episode 1 is out. Episode 2 will be out on Tuesdays. Each episode.
Tuesdays each episode. So it's 1 episode a week for the next 6 weeks. For the next sort of 5 weeks, 6 episodes in total. And I'm hoping to do a 7th episode, as there is some developments that we're working on as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, look. That's what we're here for, I suppose, to podcast and to try and tell stories in as best a way we can. It's always, you know, you feel very honoured to get somebody to trust you enough to let you into their home with a microphone and to, you know, record for so many hours when you have your guard down, and that they'll trust you enough to go away and do something with it. And so, you know, it's great to be in that position, and it's great to have the Crime World platform in order to, you know, let people know it's out there.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.